As I said a little bit earlier on, the back page headlines are all suggesting that it's arrivederci for Antonio Conte after the team was booed off at half time, and again boos in the Spurs stadium last night. Martin Lipton is with us to talk to us about this. Martin, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Is there any way this isn't the end for not just Conte but maybe some of the most important figures in Spurs history?
Well, we'll see about the latter, but for the former, yeah, he's gone. The question is when. Do they let it drag on to the end of the season, inevitably, inexorably falling apart further and further, or do they act now and get in either next season's manager, who I still suspect will be Mauricio Pochettino, or if they can't get him immediately, let Ryan Mason take it over. There is no appetite from any fan, I don't think, for it to continue. More importantly, there's no appetite from the manager for it to continue. He even said that himself, didn't it? Well, maybe they can, agree for it to happen sooner. I mean, we know what's happening now. The game's up. I think they should just bite the bullet and do it now. But I'm not Daniel Levy. He might think, well, we're going to pay him for 2 months anyhow. We might as well keep with him for 2 months. But I wouldn't.
Yeah, there's still a really good chance that they could finish in the top four. Like, that's not ridiculous at all. If they had a manager who was fully tuned in and they had a plan and they had something that was forward looking and everybody was rallying around, like, the form of the other teams around them is not so amazing that you couldn't see a situation where they could squeak into top four, which would be transformational when it comes to the summer and trying to sign players. So there's actually a lot to play for.
And that's why I think they should do it now. I don't think necessarily that a change of manager would spark a resurgence of form, but it might do. And it's preferable to this just creeping sludge which is enveloping the entire squad and team and club and fan base. And it is unfixable. It's, sometimes things reach a tipping point. And I thought before last night that it would be a defining moment, that either, they won and he'd go through at the end of the season, or they'd go out and they would have to get rid. And that, I think, is what has happened now. That performance was pitiful from start to finish. And that comes from the manager. He sets the tempo. He sets the approach. There was no tempo. There was no approach. It was the same tedious, stultifying, boring rubbish that has been actually the hallmark of the entire season.
That's the issue, Martin, isn't it? Like, the results, have been poor in stretches, but the performances and trying to watch Spurs has been a chore, because and you can sense it with the fans as well. There was times during the match last night you could hear the players on the pitch because the atmosphere was so poor. So clearly there's a disconnect there.
They have no faith in what they're watching, and you can understand why. I don't think Tottenham have played well this season. All season. They've had the odd game, but they haven't had a run of form. We thought, actually, they're playing quite well now. Now, look, yes, it hurts when you lose Bentancur as your best midfielder. Yes, you could do with the goalkeeper. But that's not the reason they didn't win yesterday. They didn't win yesterday because they didn't have the spark or ingenuity. And let's be honest, they were lucky to get away with a 0-0. I mean, Milan, who are not a good team and will go out in the next round, were infinitely better over the two legs. And they're not very good.
You were making the point there. You get the new manager in, and if it's going to be Pochettino, would there be any barrier to them getting Pochettino or Tuchel now? What would prevent them, if they're going to do this business in the summer, give that manager the opportunity to get the team into the Champions League?
The only barrier is if they didn't fancy doing it. There's nothing to stop them. They're both available. They're both unemployed. They're both waiting for a call from a club. They may decide it's too late to come in now, and we risk being reputationally damaged in terms of what we can do with this bunch of players. Or they may not trust the owner to give them enough money to buy more players, different players, in the summer. We don't know. I mean, the one thing you know is that Pochettino is aware of exactly what Daniel Levy is all about. They are still on good terms, and it would galvanise, I wouldn't say every fan, because that's not true, but it would galvanise, I suspect, the majority of the supporters if Pochettino came back.
Peter Crouch made the point after the game last night, and it was a very valid one, that what is the purpose and point of resting players in the FA Cup against Sheffield United for the Premier League and for the Champions League if you're going to go out and perform like that? Like, some of the team selections have been a bit bonkers from the outside looking in.
Well, if you say that, but you look at the team he picked against Sheffield United, and that should have been comfortably good enough to beat Sheffield United reserves, particularly given the bounce the team should have been in after beating Chelsea the previous Sunday.
But it's not your strongest team. Spurs haven't won a trophy in so long. Put out your strongest team.
It shouldn't have mattered because that should have been good enough. And they did pick the first team against Wolves, and they did pick the first team against Milan, a version of it. But at some point, the players, certain players, have got to start taking responsibility for their inaction or their failures or their disappointment. Son has been very poor this season. He's been outstanding for Tottenham for 8 years, but this season he's been really poor. Richarlison's moaning, and I understand why he might moan. He scored 2 goals all season. It's not enough. Kulusevski, since he came back from the injury, has not been the player he was before the injury. Now, maybe that's because he tried to get back too early and has suffered as a consequence. Romero is a red card waiting to happen every single game. He doesn't think. He's a World Cup winning defender. He's an outstanding player, you would say. And yet, he's a liability. And that red card, just like the one against Manchester City, you knew it was coming before his first booking.
Like you mentioned Kulusevski, granted, as you say, his form hasn't been great this season, but when Spurs need a goal, as they did last night, what's Conte doing taking off a player like Kulusevski for a defender in Dele Sanchez? Like, you could sense by the Spurs fans' reaction in the stadium as well. They were like, well, what's going on here? Like, some of the in-game decisions are raising eyebrows, I feel, Martin.
I sort of understand why that was, because the one thing you couldn't afford was to overcommit when you didn't have Dyer on the pitch before it started, and you'd already taken Emerson off, so you had no natural defenders on the pitch, and that would more likely you'd be exposed on the counter if you overcommit. So I sort of get that tactically, albeit you send it on Dele Sanchez, which is another issue altogether. But it played to the feelings of the fans that, once again, he's a defensive, boring, not interested in playing football type of coach. I don't actually believe that, but I do think, and I said, I think actually there were sound tactical reasons for that swap. It doesn't look that way if you don't score.
To go back to what might happen now, just thinking about it, one of the reasons maybe you don't want to come in yet is because you're not sure if Harry Kane will stay or leave in the summer. And if you're the manager who comes in now, then it'll look like your decision, or you've been influencing or been unable to influence Harry Kane to stay. So perhaps you want to come in after that decision has been made and then be free of any association with that decision.
No, because everyone in the world knows it's Harry Kane's decision. You know, if he decides he wants to stay, then he stays. If he decides he wants to go, he tells Daniel Levy he wants to go. No manager can alter that, because we've been here before. I wouldn't blame Kane if he had enough, to be honest. Where he want to go, where he could go, I mean, I think United are having a little push at it. Let's see. A few weeks ago, I thought Kane was going to stay. I think things were in the right direction. Now I suspect it may have changed again. He really, in his heart of hearts, wants to stay at Tottenham. But 2 years ago, he felt he couldn't stay, and that's why he pushed for the City move. And if he has the same view this time, I don't think anyone could really blame him.
If he was to say, just to play this out, say Tuchel arrives and Harry Kane decides that he wants to leave, is there still not some kind of residual sense, well, you weren't good enough to be able to convince him? Do the Spurs fans automatically give Tuchel a free pass if Kane can't be convinced to stay?
Whoever comes in, the fans would accept that it's not the manager's responsibility or fault. I don't think. They could. Spurs, if you remember, all those years ago, got in Glenn Hoddle to try to persuade Sol Campbell not to leave, and it didn't happen, and he still left, because sometimes a player makes that decision. No one blamed Hoddle at the time.
Who would you prefer to see? Who would be the most likely to be successful? Because Pochettino obviously would be going back to a scenario that he got burnt out in the last time. He's obviously older and wiser and feels like he could go back and deal with the powers that be in a way that wouldn't result in the same thing again. But it would be unusual enough for managers to go back somewhere when the situation had ended the way it did previously.
Well, I think the reality is, I've said before, that rather than sacking Pochettino when they did, they should have just given him a sabbatical to the end of the season and say, come back in July when you're refreshed, because you're absolutely shot to bits. After 5 years, he was emotionally spent, and the Champions League run basically took its toll. Now, you could say actually in that last year before then, they weren't great. Away form was appalling. But I think there comes a point where these days managers don't go on forever, and there is a natural tipping point. But when you come back again, it's a fresh start. I would go for Pochettino. I think it would be the popular choice. I think it would be the right choice. I think Pochettino feels there's unfinished business at the club and that he can take things on. And he does come back having won trophies, which of course was the criticism made of him before. Now, you might say anyone can win trophies in France at PSG. Well, maybe they can. But that doesn't change the fact that he did do quite well at PSG. And he did win the league and he did take them deep into the Champions League.
Sorry, Martin, if Harry Kane does leave for another Premier League club, say that is Manchester United, would that negatively impact his legacy among some Spurs fans? He's clearly a club legend, but you imagine if he heads abroad, it's not quite as controversial as, say, he joins a Manchester United. Will that impact Spurs fans' feelings at all on him?
Some will, but I don't think the majority will. I think the majority would accept that he's more than given of himself a decade, and that he deserves to try and win something elsewhere. Sheringham left and came back, and he was as welcome back as he was when he was there first time. That was admittedly a long time ago, but football fans haven't changed that much, have they?
I wonder if Kane was to leave, would they start to build that attack around someone like Richarlison? But we were talking this morning, Martin, about his comments to TNT Sports Brazil after the match last night, which have been picked up by a number of news organisations. Talked about saying yesterday they asked me to take a test at the gym, that if I was good, I would go to the game. At the time of the game, they left me on the bench. These are things that it is not possible to understand. This season, excuse the word, it's been shit because I don't have minutes. I suffered a little with injury. He's clearly a frustrated figure at the moment, Richarlison.
Yeah, but also as part of it is his own responsibility. He hasn't scored a goal in the Premier League, and he hasn't really looked like scoring too many goals in the Premier League. He had one disallowed for offside against Fulham. That's it. When he has had his chance, he hasn't particularly taken it. He had 25 minutes last night. I know it's not a lot, but what did he do in that 25 minutes? How many times this season have you watched a game with the Richarlison playing and thinking, oh, yeah, he's got to start the next game? Not many. Trouble is, there's been too many of those players, you say that.
If Kane goes, does it spell the end for Heung-min Son? Like it feels a bit like Ant losing Deck.
No, look, I mean, the thing for Son is he's got to find his form. He's been really poor this season. He knows it, and it's now wearing away at him. So he's trying harder and harder and dropping deeper and deeper, and actually being less effective as a consequence. So he gets the odd goal, but he isn't playing with anything like the smile on his face that we've become used to. He came off the bench and scored against West Ham, and you thought, could this be the springboard? And it hasn't been. But he's been there a long time. He's been there 8 years. I don't think there's any appetite to move him on at the moment. But were there to be a big bid from somewhere, there might be a feeling that, okay, it is time to change things up. I mean, footballers, no one goes on forever. You've got to change them eventually. It's a question of who you bring in to fill the void.
Well, that's it, really. If you're Pochettino, for example, and you expect that Kane might leave and there's an opportunity to move Son on as well, then suddenly you've got a massive amount of money plus whatever they're going to promise you, and maybe you get that in writing this time if you're Pochettino, or at least a text message saying, no, we'll give you 100 million. Some facts to try and back up your arguing power. Then you can see easily how the team would be recast next season with plenty of spending power in the summer and an attractive manager like Pochettino to bring in new talent.
There's no reason why Tottenham shouldn't be successful in the medium to long term, even in the short term. I mean, financially, they're better placed than probably anybody else because of the revenue that they get in, and the, at the moment, low wages to revenue ratio of 47%. The revenue is going to go up. Even if they're not in the Champions League, they're still going to have 450 million in revenue. This season, they're going to have nearly 500 million in revenue. Very few teams have got that spending power, that financial power. And remember that the debt repayment on the stadium is only 17 million a year. The capital still has to be repaid, but the debt element of it is only 17 million a year. So they're not in a bad place. They can afford to spend a great deal more. They're just, at the moment, choosing not to.
The story that the Glazers perhaps deciding to not sell, does this maybe flush out some other potential buyers for Spurs and rekindle that story? Or What's your view on that situation?
Well, if it's right that the Glazers are deciding to go to this latest idea I hear of basically hiving off the commercial arm and staying with the club and trying to work on that, which is possible, then suitors who were interested in Premier League football and can't get into United will think, what's the next best one that's available? And without question, the next best one that's available for the right price of around £4 billion, I guess, is Tottenham.
So, a good chance or like pie in the sky in your view?
Well, I think that that Joe Lewis would sell, but he wants his money. Daniel, I think would be probably more reluctant to sell because what does he do after football? His football, the football club has become his life. But as I said, nothing goes on forever. There are investors who've already looked at Tottenham. At the moment, they're not willing, it seems, to meet the valuation. But if they're the biggest property on the market, then maybe that valuation does become more realistic.
Yeah. Well, availability drives, or demand drives price. So great to have you with us, Martin. Thanks a million for joining us. Cheers.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye-bye.
It's Martin Lipton giving us his thoughts on the Spurs situation.